In the endless nightmare that is the 41st millennium, where heroes are forged in blood and glory, this story begins with a man who possessed neither. A man whose entire existence unfolded in silence, in shadows, in the forgotten corners of humanity's most crowded and most miserable machines of survival. A janitor, one of billions, whose footsteps echoed through empty tunnels long after the voices of the living had faded. He wasn't special, not in any way that mattered to the Imperium. He wasn't strong, or clever, or unusually brave. He was simply there. A constant, lingering presence in a world that had no room to notice people like him. In a hive city so enormous that it devoured millions just to keep its forges burning, he was nothing more than a speck drifting through the soot-choked air. His days were spent sweeping corridors that stretched for kilometers, wiping grime from rusted control panels, scrubbing pipes whose interiors he could navigate by memory alone. His existence was defined by cleaning what others dirtied, repairing what others broke, and disappearing whenever an overseer walked by. No one ever asked his name. No one ever cared. The Hive City itself, Hive Velcora, was a monstrous, groaning titan of metal and misery, a vertical labyrinth where the rich suffocated in luxury above while the poor suffocated in filth below. The upper spires pierced the heavens, glittering in the toxic light of distant manufactoria fires. But far beneath the choking fog, in the underbelly where the sun had never been seen, the janitor walked paths that even the arbits hesitated to enter. Down here, the walls sweated rust. The air tasted like corrosion. Mold clung to metal like hungry fingers, and pipes sang with pressure that could burst flesh from bone. Yet this world, the world no one else wanted, was the only one he knew. People rarely spoke down in the lowest levels unless they needed something. Even then, they avoided his gaze. Messages were short. Orders were shorter. The janitor lived his life in silence, his only company the hum of clogged vents and the drip of ancient pipes. Every day blended into the next, a cycle of work that never ended and never felt meaningful. But if there was one thing he possessed, one thing that would one day matter, it was this: he knew the hive's infrastructure better than any living soul. He knew which pipes carried water, which carried chemicals, which carried waste. He knew where ducts connected and where they dead-ended. He knew how the air moved, how pressure shifted, how the city breathed. And he was the first to notice when that breath changed. It began subtly, in ways no one else would have cared enough to observe. Waste that no longer broke down despite full incineration. A strange thickness in the sludge that he had scraped from pipes for decades. Fungal patches that grew not in the damp corners of the underhive, but unheated metal that should have been far too hot to support any organic life. He found workers coughing violently, black mucus dripping from their lips. He smelled rot in the corridors where nothing organic had existed for years. He tried to tell his overseer, but the man waved him off with the same irritation he gave every complaint. "Do your job," he had said, "and don't waste my time." But the janitor knew something was wrong. Horribly wrong. One cycle, while clearing a blockage in a primary disposal conduit, he felt the metal floor vibrate with an unfamiliar rhythm, as if something alive, something heavy, was moving deep inside the pipes. He paused. The hum died. Silence settled. When he reached inside the clogged vent, expecting sludge or broken machinery, his fingertips brushed something soft. Something warm. Something that twitched. He pulled his hand back immediately. His breath trembled. Slowly, he aimed his light into the vent. A face stared back at him. Bloated. Greenish. Covered in sores that oozed thick, viscous fluid. The eyes were unfocused, staring in different directions, but the mouth moved. Not a scream. Not a cry. A wet, rattling breath filled with foulness he could taste from meters away. And carved into the man's diseased, splitting skin, as if etched by rotting fingers, was a symbol the janitor had only seen in forbidden pamphlets seized by the arbits, the symbol whispered by zealots before they were burned. 3 circles. Connected. Ancient. Filthy. Nurgle. The janitor stumbled backward. The corpse, or whatever remained of it, twitched again, as if life and decay fought for control of the same rotting flesh. In the darkness of the tunnels, that symbol seemed to glow with a sickening, pulsating rhythm, like the beating of a diseased heart. Something inside the vent pulsed with it. And at that moment, the janitor understood two things. Something monstrous had entered the hive. And no one, absolutely no one, would believe him. Because that was exactly what gnawed at the janitor as he stood alone in the dim, dripping corridor, staring into the dead yet not dead face inside the vent. And before we dive deeper into how this quiet, overlooked man uncovered an outbreak capable of drowning an entire hive city in decay, stay with this story until the very end, because the truth about what he discovered, and the unimaginable decision he would one day have to make, is more shocking than anything you might expect. And trust me, your reward for watching to the end is understanding a secret that the Imperium itself would bury if it could. He staggered backward from the vent, hands trembling, the taste of rot coating his tongue. The corpse twitched again, a wet shudder that rippled through flesh that should have been long dead. He had cleaned every kind of filth the hive could produce, sewage blockages, chemical spills, masses of unidentified organic waste, but nothing had ever moved on its own. Nothing had ever looked back at him. And certainly nothing had ever carried the mark of a chaos god carved into its flesh like a grotesque badge of honor. He knew what Nurgle represented. Everyone did, even if only through half-whispered tales shared in the lower levels late at night. The Plague Father, the Lord of Decay, a being whose gift spread in boils, in rot, in delirious laughter that bubbled up from dying throats. Yet the janitor had never imagined those horrors could reach here. Not in the winding tunnels of his hive. Not in the pipes he had walked since childhood. The hive above him rumbled with its usual ceaseless mechanical heartbeats, cargo trams shaking old steel, manufactoria stamping out weapons, millions of boots marching in patterns that never stopped. Life continued overhead as normal, blind to the sickness gestating beneath their feet. It struck him then, with a cold clarity, if he walked away from this vent right now, if he pretended he hadn't seen the symbol carved in rotting flesh, the hive would continue marching straight toward a disaster no one could escape. But what could he do? He was a janitor, nameless, ignored, invisible. People barely listened to him when he told them a pipe was bursting. Why would they believe him now, when he said a plague was taking root in the guts of the hive? Still, he forced himself to act. He reported it. He explained what he'd seen, stumbling over his words, terrified and desperate. His overseer didn't even look up from his data slate. Bodies turn up everywhere, the man muttered. Stop bothering me with garbage. If there's a blockage, clear it. If there's a corpse, call disposal. That's your job. Your job. Those two words struck harder than anything else, as if all his life could be summed up in two dismissive syllables. As if the warning he was trying to give, a warning that could save millions, was nothing but an inconvenience to someone higher on the food chain. But the janitor knew what he saw. And as the cycles passed, things only grew worse. Workers coughed blood onto metal floors, their skin greening around the edges. Fungal clusters appeared in places where no light, no moisture, and no life had any business existing. Even the air felt wrong, thicker, heavier, almost warm with a moist, rotten breath. One day, while repairing a filtration vent deep in the lower stacks, he found a smear of slime across the wall. Not unusual, not at first glance. But this slime pulsed, as if breathing. That was when fear gave way to certainty. Something was spreading, something alive, something hungry. And the terrifying part wasn't that no one believed him. The terrifying part was that no one even cared enough to listen. The Hive City was sick. And he was the only one who knew how deep the infection truly went. The janitor tried to push the horror from his mind, but the hive refused to let him forget. Every corridor he passed through felt different now. The air carried a faint, sour tang that hadn't been there before. The lights flickered more often, as if something unseen gnawed at the power grid. People moved with sluggish steps, coughing into their sleeves, rubbing at sores that had begun appearing on their arms and necks. At first, he thought he was imagining it. But the patterns became impossible to ignore. Entire work crews were being replaced because half their members were too ill to stand. Sanitation drones whirred past carrying sealed bio-waste containers with red warning symbols that hadn't been used in years. Even the arbits began to appear more frequently in the lower levels, walking in pairs, weapons readied, as though expecting violence. As he made his rounds, he overheard whispers, families locked inside their halves, neighbors who hadn't been seen for days, rumors of bodies being taken away in the night. The janitor paused in the dim light of a maintenance corridor when he heard two workers muttering in fear. One said he saw a man collapse in the drinking lines, bleeding from the eyes. Another swore a whole section of the underhive had been sealed by force. But the most disturbing part was the uneasy silence that followed each rumor. People didn't question it. They didn't demand answers. They simply accepted it, as though mass sickness was just another inconvenience in their miserable lives. And perhaps, in a place like Hive Velcora, it was. But the janitor could feel something far deeper underlying it all. It lingered in the metal beneath his hands, in the steam rising from the vents, in the strange echoes that traveled through the pipes like distant, muffled moans. He had lived his entire life surrounded by machinery, by the heartbeat of the hive. He knew its rhythms as intimately as he knew his own. And these rhythms were changing, growing erratic, feverish, contaminated. One cycle, while walking through the lower filtration corridors, he noticed a door sealed shut with crimson purity tape. Arbit's symbols were stamped across it. He would have ignored it. He always ignored anything involving the arbits, until he smelled the rot seeping from the cracks in the frame. Not the normal stench of waste or decay. This was sweet, sickly, like fruit left to liquefy in the sun. His stomach twisted. He stepped closer. Something wet pooled beneath the door, slowly spreading across the metal floor. It was thick, mucus-like, greenish-brown. His breath hitched. Whatever was inside that sealed room, it was no ordinary contamination. He backed away, only to freeze at the sight of something new, strange, pale tendrils growing from the ceiling above the door. They had not been there the day before. They pulsed faintly, like veins carrying diseased blood. He stared at them in horror, realizing they weren't just growing on the hive. They were feeding on it. By the time he reached the waste processing hub later that cycle, 5 operators had already been sent home due to illness. The remaining workers coughed constantly, their voices hoarse, their eyes sunken. The janitor watched as a supervisor tried to stabilize a machine coughing out foul-smelling steam. The man's hands bled from small cracks that seemed to appear every time he moved. When he brushed past the janitor felt the unnatural heat radiating off his body. And then the first scream echoed through the chamber. A worker collapsed, convulsing violently, his limbs jerking in unnatural angles. His skin bubbled with blisters that swelled and burst, releasing clouds of foul vapor. People backed away, horrified. The man thrashed on the floor, frothing, until he went still. For a moment, silence held the room like a noose. Then the corpse twitched. Just once. But it was enough. Someone shouted for the arbits. Someone else ran. The janitor simply stood frozen, unable to look away. Because on the man's forearm, fresh, carved by something unseen, were 3 circles. Perfect. Interlocking. Pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the skin. The same mark he had seen carved into the corpse in the vent. The outbreak wasn't beginning. It had already begun. And it was spreading faster than anyone could realize. The janitor left the waste processing hub with the screams still clinging to him like the stench of rot. Even as he walked away, he could hear the echo of the workers' last wet gasp, the sticky sound of bursting blisters, the distant shouts of arbits sealing off the chamber. But what disturbed him most wasn't the death itself. People died every day in Hive Velcora, crushed in machinery, suffocated in vents, starved in the lower stacks. No, what cut deeper was the realization that death was no longer the end. Not here. Not now. Not in a Hive City unknowingly offering itself to Nurgle like a banquet. He tried to return to his tasks, to force his hands into the familiar rhythm of cleaning and maintenance, but every motion felt heavy, sluggish, weighted by dread. The pipes hissed louder than usual, groaning as though in pain. The walls trembled with odd vibrations that didn't match any machinery he recognized. Even the hive's recycled air carried a strange thickness, like invisible spores clung to every breath. As he passed through the recycling conduits, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The filtration tanks, massive cylinders that churned waste into usable byproduct, were coated in a pale film. It looked like mold at first, until it pulsed. Slowly, deliberately, like a heartbeat. When he leaned closer, he heard something beneath the machinery's rumbling, a faint, wet gurgling. Soft, but unmistakably organic. He staggered back. He knew these machines better than anyone alive. He had cleaned them for decades. Nothing alive had ever clung to them. Nothing had ever throbbed beneath their metal shells. He placed his hand on the side of one cylinder and nearly recoiled. The metal was warm. Warm. Machines at this level were never warm. A shiver crawled through him. Something was growing inside the infrastructure itself. That cycle, instead of returning to his quarters, he made a choice that would change everything. He followed the contamination. Not because he was brave, but because fear had finally sharpened into clarity. The plague was already spreading through the hive's veins. If he didn't understand how, no one would. He walked deeper into the underlevels, places so forgotten that even the rats avoided them, where lights flickered like dying stars and the air tasted like rust and mold. It was here, in the half-flooded tunnels beneath the water reclamation systems, that he found the first real proof of his worst fear. A man stood at the end of the corridor, facing the wall, muttering softly. The janitor called out, but the figure didn't move. He stepped closer, cautiously. The man's shoulders twitched with each whisper. When he reached out and touched the man's sleeve, the figure turned. The janitor recoiled in horror. The man's face was covered in lesions, his eyes sunken and jaundiced. His lips were stretched into a grotesque smile, cracked and oozing. But it wasn't his appearance that made the janitor stumble backward. It was what the man was doing. His hands were pressed flat to the wall, and beneath his palms, the metal was soft. Warped, almost fleshy, like diseased tissue fused with steel. And the wall wasn't still, it was moving, expanding and contracting as though breathing in shallow, sick rhythm. The man pressed his face against the pulsating surface, whispering praises to a father of filth. A father of gifts. Grandfather Nurgle. The janitor felt bile rise in his throat. He stumbled away, trying not to scream, but the man didn't chase him. He simply turned back toward the living wall, pressing himself deeper into its folds as if embracing a god. The janitor ran. His footsteps splashed through shallow puddles, echoing in the labyrinth of tunnels as his lungs strained for clean air. He didn't stop until he reached a service hatch that led into the waste transfer arteries of the hive, long, narrow ducts that fed into every level above. And that was where he found the bodies. Not fresh, not intact. They were swollen, ruptured, their skin split open to reveal thick, oozing growths that pulsed like tumors feeding on the hive's circulation system. Some had been arranged deliberately, positioned around the ducts as if forming a ritual pattern. Others looked as though they had simply collapsed while crawling toward some unseen destination. Flies buzzed lazily over them, sinking into their wounds. The air was suffocatingly sweet. He covered his mouth, choking on panic as he realized the truth. These ducts weren't being used to dispose of waste. They were being used to move something. Spores, rot, tendrils, corruption. The cult wasn't spreading by chance. They were using the hive's infrastructure as a delivery system. And the janitor, of all people, was the only one who understood exactly how catastrophic that was. His legs shook, his vision blurred, but he forced himself to keep going, pushed forward by dread and instinct and a terrible understanding. The Hive City wasn't dying. It was being infected, and no one else knew. The janitor didn't remember how long he wandered through the lower arteries of the hive. Time lost meaning in those depths, buried under layers of rust, filth, and the slow, suffocating pulse of corruption. The tunnels wound in impossible patterns, branching off into shafts so narrow he had to squeeze sideways, then opening into cavernous chambers filled with pipes big enough to swallow an entire hab block. Everywhere he looked, the hive felt sick, its metal bones sagging beneath the weight of decay, its lights dimmed, its breath hitching in mechanical gasps. He followed the signs of contamination deeper and deeper, guided not by courage but by grim inevitability. Something inside him knew he hadn't yet reached the heart of the plague. What he had seen so far, breathing walls, pulsing mold, hollow-eyed cultists whispering praise to the Rotfather, felt like symptoms. Horrific, yes, but not the cause. Not the source. The hive was rotting from the inside out, and he was descending toward the place where the infection began. The deeper he went, the more unnatural the air became. Thick, humid, heavy with spores that clung to his throat. He wiped sweat from his brow only to realize it wasn't sweat at all. It was condensation from the very air, sticky and tinged faintly green. His breathing grew ragged. His steps grew sluggish. But he pushed forward, because every instinct screamed that turning back meant watching an entire city drown in plague. Eventually, he reached a sealed access hatch. He recognized it instantly, one of the primary gates beneath the sludge reservoirs, a place workers rarely entered even in emergencies. It was supposed to be locked permanently, its interior chambers long abandoned due to structural instability. But the hatch wasn't locked anymore. It hung open, and something had forced it open from the inside. Metal was bent outward, warped and melted at the edges. Rusted bolts lay scattered across the floor like broken teeth. The cultists bowed toward the pulsating abomination, their voices rising in worshipful ecstasy. One stepped forward, a figure taller than the rest. His skin was so heavily cracked and ruptured that bones jutted through in places. Green fluid dripped from his fingertips as he lifted a rusted censer filled with steaming filth. He spoke to the mass, his voice wet and bubbling. Father watches. Father gifts. The bloom shall rise. The hive shall rot. Through decay comes rebirth. The room trembled with each word, as though the creature at the center answered the prayer with its own sickening pulse. The janitor clamped a hand over his mouth to stifle a gasp. His legs nearly gave out. No training, no weapon, no allies. And yet here he was, staring at the birthplace of a catastrophe the Imperium would never see coming until it was far too late. This was the seed of the blossom, and the cultists were preparing it to bloom. He ducked behind a leaking pipe as one of the worshippers turned, pustules popping as he moved. The janitor's heart hammered. He didn't breathe, not until the chanting resumed. He had seen enough, more than enough. But as he backed away, one horrifying truth settled over him like a burial shroud. This wasn't just an outbreak. It was a deliberate infestation, engineered, nurtured, and ready to erupt through the hive's infrastructure like a tidal wave of rot. And no one else knew it existed. It began with an odor. Not the usual sour stench that drifted through every hive. Those who lived here were long accustomed to the sweat, chemicals, recycled air, and decay of billions crammed into one metal coffin of a city. No, this one was different. Finer, sharper, a scent that felt alive, like it crawled into a man's sinuses and sat there, pulsing. Janitors noticed it first, because janitors always notice first. They see every pipe, every vent, every puddle, every stain that shouldn't be there. And Malker, he noticed before all of them. He was sweeping near a waste incineration shaft when a faint sweetness brushed across his face. Not pleasant, never pleasant, but strangely warm, as if rot had been left to ferment under a summer sun that the hive never actually saw. The torch brigade workers nearby didn't react, they were too busy arguing about rations. The servitors simply droned their protocols, oblivious to the creeping wrongness in the air. But Malker froze. Something inside him recoiled, some instinct honed over decades of surviving this brutal world. Later, he realized that this was the first whisper of Nurgle's caress drifting through the underworks. He tried to ignore it, at first. What could he do? Report it. To whom? A sanitation worker complaining about a smell in a hive where everything smelled like death. Commissars would laugh. Enforcers would shrug. Administratum clerks would file the complaint, forget the file, and die of old age before ever reading it. But the odor did not fade. It thickened. It clung. It began following him through corridors, spilling out of ducts and grates in places no smell should ever reach. And then came the workers, 2 of them, coughing with a wet heaviness that made his skin crawl. One wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, and left behind a smear of greenish mucus. Not normal mucus. It glistened. It stretched like living slime. The man laughed it off, saying he was just coming down with something. But Malker saw the rot forming beneath the skin of his neck, tiny pustules like the early buds of a disease that didn't belong to any natural pathogen. That was when Malker knew this wasn't just filth. Not just contamination. This was corruption, the kind that crept through the warp before it ever showed itself in flesh. The vents began breathing out warm air that felt almost humid, impossible in the lower hive. Moisture gathered on the walls, dripping slowly like condensation from a feverish beast. Oily patterns formed in the grime, swirling like sigils if one stared too long. Rats grew sluggish. Servitors malfunctioned. Even the light strips flickered with an almost organic cadence, like the heartbeat of something enormous and unseen. Malker stopped pretending this was normal. He began mapping where he smelled it the strongest, where workers coughed the most, where sludge in the drains took on a sickly pale green sheen. Every corridor he swept, he watched. Every pipe he scrubbed, he listened. The hive was whispering, and not in the mechanical groans it usually made. Something new was breathing in its metal bones. And deep down, Malker realized something horrifying. This wasn't the outbreak. This was just the invitation. And the hive, his hive, had already begun to answer. The deeper Malker went into the hive's underworks, the more the metal seemed to sweat. Pipes rattled like lungs struggling to breathe, and the usual gray condensation had turned into a murky yellow sludge that clung to his boots in sticky strands. But it wasn't the filth that unnerved him. It was the silence. This part of the hive was never quiet. Normally, servitors clanked along their tracks, sump fluid dripped into drains, cogitators hummed with endless data, and distant machinery throbbed like the heartbeat of an ancient titan. But now, nothing. Even the insects, those hardy, near-immortal roach things that fed on anything, had disappeared. The quiet pressed against Malker's skull like a weight. That's when he saw the first grate. A maintenance vent he had cleaned countless times was sagging now, the metal warped outward as if something inside had swelled against it. The screws had been forced loose, and a pale green residue seeped from the edges, thick as curdled fat. Malker crouched, his breath tight in his throat, and reached out with the end of his mop handle. The metal crumbled at the slightest touch, flaking like diseased skin. He pushed the grate aside. And what lay beneath looked nothing like the waste channels he knew. A fleshy membrane, thin as paper, stretched across the shaft like a biological film. Beneath it, something pulsed. Something alive. Slow, rhythmic movements throbbed like the breathing of a creature buried deep under the hive's floor. The membrane itself was covered in tiny pustules that quivered with each pulse, as though waiting to burst. Malker jerked back, nearly slipping. This wasn't possible. This was the realm of nightmares priests warned children about. Warp-tainted, chaotic, unclean. His mind raced. He needed to report this. Someone had to see it. Someone had to. A whisper broke the silence. Not sound, pressure. A ripple in the air. A sensation that slid across his thoughts like cold slime. Warmth. Life. Such fragile hope. The voice wasn't a voice at all, but the psychic echo of something vast and ancient and patient. Something that had been invited, no, welcomed into the hive through every ignored wound, every unclean corner, every forgotten piece of rusting machinery. Nurgle's presence was already budding, already rooting itself into the hive's decayed infrastructure. Malker stumbled backward, heart pounding, mop clattering against the ground. The membrane pulsed again, more vigorously now, as though reacting to his fear. A faint hiss escaped from the shaft, warm, damp, and reeking of moldy sweetness. Then he noticed the footprints. Not human footprints. Something heavier. Three-toed. Smeared through the residue in long, dragging patterns, leading away from the grate and deeper into the dark maintenance corridors. Whatever had crawled out of there hadn't gone far. Malker closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breath. He had worked these halls for decades, faced plague rats, collapsing pipes, malfunctioning servitors, and even a minor chem leak that nearly dissolved him. But nothing had ever made him want to run like this. Yet he didn't run, because if he didn't understand what had already taken root, then the hive was doomed. So he picked up his mop, his only weapon, his only comfort, and followed the footprints into the dark. Malker's feet sank into the thick sludge that had begun pooling along the maintenance corridors. Each step left a muted squelch that echoed through the hollow tunnels, a warning he couldn't afford to hear. Above him, the machinery groaned, its rhythms uneven, off-tempo, like the heartbeat of a creature in pain. Every vent, every grate, every pipe now seemed alive with the same unnatural pulse he had glimpsed earlier. The hive itself had become a vessel, feeding a rot that was growing faster than anyone could perceive. The footprints led him to a junction where three ducts converged, each disappearing into darkness that smelled of decay and something far worse. The further he went, the more he noticed the patterns, the same greenish slime coating the walls, the way the air moved like it was being exhaled from 1,000 diseased lungs, the quiet hum that wasn't mechanical at all. He realized the spores weren't just spreading randomly, they were traveling along predictable paths, water lines, air ducts, waste channels, all conduits he knew better than anyone alive. A wave of despair washed over him. If the cultists were using the hive's veins to deliver this plague, and the spores were capable of spreading undetected through every system he had maintained for decades, then the city above was already infected. Millions of lives hung by a thread he could barely reach, let alone control. He had no rank, no weapon, no authority, and even if he shouted from the highest spire, would anyone listen? Would anyone even understand? He pressed on. Fear and duty had merged into a singular purpose. He was the only one who could navigate these passages without dying. He was the only one who could see the infection for what it was. And that knowledge, that awful, burning knowledge, had become a burden heavier than any mop or broom he had ever carried. As he crawled through a narrow duct leading into the sludge reservoirs, he began to feel the first effects of exposure. His throat burned, lungs stung with each breath, and a fever crept across his body. He coughed, hacking wetly, tasting the rot in every inhale. The spores were not passive, they sought life, and he felt them probing at the edges of his own vitality. Each step was a risk. Each breath could be his last. Yet he couldn't stop. Because the moment he hesitated, he imagined the city above, millions of citizens unaware of the creeping death, the hab blocks filling with the coughing, swelling, infected. He imagined children, factory workers, priests, mercenaries, all victims of a corruption that had begun in silence and would end in slaughter if he did nothing. And in that instant, Malker understood the cruel truth of his existence. He was invisible. A nameless, faceless janitor. His life meant nothing to the city above. No one would record his warnings. No one would celebrate his efforts. And yet, whether the world noticed or not, he was the only chance it had. The realization settled into him like molten lead. It was not courage, not heroism, not pride, it was responsibility. He alone bore the knowledge, and with it, the weight of entire millions. The burden twisted his stomach, clawed at his mind, but he did not collapse. He could not. He would not. The hive depended on him, even if it didn't know it. Ahead, the narrow tunnel opened into a larger chamber. The smell was worse here. The air was hot and thick, pungent with rot that made his stomach heave. And yet, there was something else, movement, faint but undeniable. Pulsing, alive. Malker steadied himself against the wall, gripping his mop like a lifeline. He knew that whatever awaited him ahead was not just the work of diseased men, it was something older, something grander, and far more terrible. And in that moment, he realized that the fight had already begun. The janitor was no longer simply cleaning a hive. He had become its unwilling guardian. Malker stepped into the chamber, and the air hit him like a living thing. Thick, sweet, sickly air that clung to his skin, seeped into his lungs, and made his head spin. The light above flickered, throwing shadows that danced across walls glistening with greenish slime. The source of the pulse he had sensed grew stronger here, like the heartbeat of something massive, something monstrous, feeding on the very metal of the hive. At first, he saw only shapes. Bulbous forms hanging from the pipes, writhing, oozing, almost breathing. Then, movement. A figure, or what had once been a figure, staggered toward him. Its skin was stretched and blistered, patches of decay exposing muscles and sinew beneath. Its eyes rolled in every direction, as though chaos itself had replaced its vision. Foul, dripping pustules covered its arms, and a strange green aura seemed to radiate from its very flesh. Malker froze. Fear gripped him like iron shackles. This was not a worker sick with the beginnings of rot. This was a living, conscious infection, a spawn of Nurgle himself. Its head tilted, and it emitted a wet, gurgling hiss that reverberated through the chamber. The smell hit him fully then, the sweet, rotten stench of a god's blessing on decay. He wanted to run. He wanted to turn back, climb the corridors, escape. But every instinct honed over decades in the underworks, the knowledge of pipes, vents, and dead ends, kept him rooted. He had walked these tunnels countless times. He knew the paths of the hive like no one else could. And he understood that there was no escape from this confrontation, not if the hive was to survive. The creature lurched forward, and instinct forced him into action. He swung the mop, more out of desperation than strategy, aiming for the dripping pustules on its arm. The tip struck, splattering a burst of green ichor. The thing recoiled, its wet gurgle turning into a shriek that echoed through the pipes. Yet it advanced again, relentless, its every movement leaving sticky trails of decay that hissed where they touched metal. Malker's hands shook. His breath came in ragged gasps. Fever and fatigue gnawed at him from the exposure to the spores, yet he forced himself to think. He knew these tunnels, he knew the machinery. If he could draw the creature toward the filtration ducts, perhaps he could contain it. Perhaps he could slow its spread long enough for others to respond, though, in truth, he knew no one would. The chase began. The thing lurched and lunged, every strike releasing a spray of Nurgle's taint. Malker darted through narrow passages, crawling under pipes, vaulting over pools of slime, dragging the thing with him just far enough to keep it pursuing. Every pulse of the creature was a heartbeat against his ribs, every breath a wave of rot against his lungs. His body ached, his muscles trembled, but he refused to stop. The hive depended on him. Only him. Finally, he reached a junction near the filtration hub, a section he had repaired countless times. Here, he had leverage. The machinery could be used, not as it was intended, but as a weapon. He knew that if he could seal the ducts and reverse the pressure, he could force the bloom back, even if only temporarily. Even if it killed him in the process. The creature barreled forward one last time, its pustules bursting on contact with the walls. Malker lunged for the control panel, fumbling with the levers and valves. Metal clanged under the weight of decay, sparks flew, and the air thickened with a choking, sweet miasma. Then, with a shuddering roar that vibrated through his very bones, the machinery hissed to life. Pipes groaned, vents spat superheated air, and the creature's advance faltered, its pulsing form writhing violently as it was forced back by the sudden pressure. Malker collapsed to the floor, drenched in sweat, slime, and his own exhaustion. The creature shrieked, convulsed, and in a final, wet pulse, it recoiled into a corner of the chamber. Its advance was stopped, for now. The spores retreated into the walls, the vents, the machinery, and the hive seemed to sigh, as if relieved, at least temporarily. He lay there, trembling, knowing that this was only the beginning. He had confronted the bloom, but it had not been destroyed. The hive remained sick, the cultists still lurked, and the heart of Nurgle's infestation still pulsed somewhere deeper than he had reached. And Malker, just a janitor, invisible to the world above, understood the weight of what he had undertaken. The burden of a city's survival now rested on his shoulders, alone. Malker pressed onward, deeper into the bowels of the hive than he had ever dared go before. Every step carried him further from sunlight, further from the world above, and deeper into a living nightmare of rotten decay. The air grew thick and heavy, each breath tasting like spoiled meat mixed with chemical runoff. Every surface pulsated faintly, as if the hive itself were infected, breathing through the tunnels and ducts like a diseased lung. He had walked these corridors countless times, yet now, every familiar turn felt alien, twisted, corrupted, alive. And then he saw it. The cultists' chamber he had been seeking revealed itself at last. But it was no ordinary room. It was vast, impossibly vast, and every inch of it throbbed with life. At its center rose a grotesque, undulating mass of flesh, metal, and filth, the heart of the infestation. Pipes fused seamlessly into bloated tissue, organs grew along steel girders, and spores spilled into the air in thick clouds that drifted lazily toward the city above. It pulsed rhythmically, as though the hive itself were exhaling, feeding on decay. The cultists swarmed around it, chanting, their voices wet and gurgling, praising the Rotfather with a devotion that sent chills down Malker's spine. For a long moment, he simply watched. Every fiber of his being screamed to flee, but he could not. His knowledge of the hive, the veins and arteries of its infrastructure, told him that this was the source, the generator, the core of a plague that could consume millions in a single cycle if left unchecked. And he also knew the impossible truth. To stop it, he would have to enter its heart, to place himself in the very epicenter of decay. He thought of the city above, millions of lives oblivious to the horror growing beneath their feet. He thought of the workers coughing in the lower stacks, the children in hab blocks, the priests and soldiers marching unknowingly toward contamination. No one would save them. No one would even try. The burden fell solely on him. And then the logic of his choice crystallized in a single, brutal sentence: if he acted, he would almost certainly die. But if he hesitated, the entire Hive City would perish. Malker took a trembling breath, tightened his grip on his mop, his only companion, his only tool, and stepped forward. Each movement brought him closer to the living engine of rot, closer to the bloated, pulsating heart of the bloom. His skin crawled as he felt the spores brush against his face, his lungs stung, and the chamber's oppressive heat pressed down on him like a living weight. But he continued. One step, then another. The cultists parted around him, their chanting reaching a fevered pitch, yet none tried to stop him. Perhaps they sensed he was the one destined to enter the bloom, to deliver the decision that only a forgotten soul could. When he reached the controls, rusted valves and machinery fused to the flesh of the hive, he realized how fragile the plan was. By reversing the pressure systems and triggering the purge, he could incinerate the bloom and force the spores back into containment. But the heat, the pressure, the toxic surge of disease, would almost certainly end him. His heart raced, sweat and bile running freely. Every instinct screamed to flee. Yet as he glanced at the pulsating, living mass before him, at the cultists worshipping the Rotfather, at the pipes that fed the city above, he understood the choice was simple.